And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the Geographer of the United States. Lee Schwartz is the 9th Geographer of the United States, or GOATUS as we affectionately call him, in the 102-year history of the office. He is considered to be one of the world's foremost geographers. He and his office are responsible for providing guidance to all federal agencies on questions of international boundaries and sovereignty claims. But beyond this official role, Lee has used his skills and influence to add a geographical dimension to virtually all facets of government operations. And I suspect if you were to ask him of what work he is most proud of, he would respond with his groundbreaking work on using geospatial tools and technology to assist in solving the wide range of humanitarian concerns and problems that our government assists with around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to present Dr. Lee Schwartz.
Well, thank you very much, John. And I want to thank UNSL and Chancellor Sobolik for hosting this event with the American Geographical Society. I think it's also time to thank Brian Monheiser. He hasn't been thanked in about 2.5 hours, I think. So allow me to, I know how hard he works helping out on a whole host of things. And I had the distinct pleasure of actually lecturing at his son's geography class virtually during COVID. And Michael Faust is here, which is his teacher. And I'm happy to say that he's going to be teaching AP Human Geography next year at the high school level. And I think we all owe a vote of thanks to our educators. Both of my parents were educators, and I think more than anything, if we're going to solve the future of a host of problems in the world, it's going to be up to our teachers and educators. So let's give a big round of applause to them. And I'm sorry I can't stay for the workshop tomorrow. So looking outward as far as 2050 is not really core to the work of the Department of State, where most of our diplomats and policymakers are focused more on imminent events and issues. And it's not really, food security is not really my wheelhouse either. So I've decided to talk more about something I do know about, and that is conflict. I'm going to direct my comments today towards conflict at the global scale, not a heartland perspective, because the work at the Department of State is, of course, working on our foreign policy and looking at some of the challenges we face worldwide. Conflict today remains the largest single driver of food insecurity globally, and there are more food insecure people in the world today than ever before. And in fact, the 10 worst food crises in the world have all been caused or worsened by conflict. 70% of the hungriest people in the world live in regions that are affected by war and violence. So I said that the State Department is not typically focused on long-term issues, though I, of course, would argue that peace and conflict resolution is a long-term issue and challenge. But we are fortunate in the Office of the Geographer of the Department of State to be providing weekly intelligence briefings to both the Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, and the Special Envoy for Global Food Security, Carrie Fowler. And both of those diplomats are certainly looking forward in their roles. I actually just spoke with Dr. Fowler yesterday and told him I was coming out here. He said he owes a visit to St. Louis, so you might see him here in the near future. And he's working on a couple of long-term strategies. One of those is what is called the Roadmap for Global Food Security, and another was just recently announced, which is called the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils, or VACS, which focuses on adapting underutilized nutrition crops in Africa specifically for climate resilience and soil conservation and restoration. And Secretary of State Blinken recently identified global food security as one of his top legacy priorities. And just 3 weeks ago, Secretary Blinken spoke at the National Academies of Sciences during the presentation of the 2023 World Food Prize, which was established to recognize global peace through agriculture. In acknowledging the winner, Heidi Kuhn, not Heidi Klum, who heads up the NGO Roots for Peace, Secretary Blinken emphasized that food security is essential to global welfare, security, and peace. And it is worth noting that Heidi Kuhn was actually not present to accept the prize because she was working on a landmine demining project in Azerbaijan. It's very difficult to till the land if it's filled with landmines, and there are literally hundreds of thousands of square miles of landmines around the world today. So getting back to the title of my presentation, if feeding our future planet is not about more food, then what is it about? So not wanting to bury the lead any further, feeding our future planet is essentially an issue of equity. This says next slide. I did it. So Chris Tucker, who recently wrote a book called The Planet of 3 Billion, would probably argue that feeding the future world is more an issue of population, or at least population is central to that. And as you can see there, by 2050, the world's going to be almost 10 billion people. And if we successfully fed 90% of the world, that would still leave us with a billion hungry people. And by 2100, in some predictions, Africa is projected to actually pass Asia in terms of the number of people. And I think Africa is a continent that is certainly worth focusing. Population increase in Africa in rural areas will increase by 50% by 2050. And that will not only increase the challenges of rural hunger, but will also drive further rural to urban migration. So it's a compounded problem we have. If we want to focus on Africa right there, you can see the steep curve there compared to Asia. And most of my talk now will probably end up focusing on Africa, because that's the part of the world that my office focuses on most. I should say that the Office of the Geographer and Global Issues is in the Bureau of Intelligence Research at the Department of State. We have a division that focuses on cartography and boundary analysis. We have another division that does more traditional intelligence analysis on global issues such as food security, water security, public health, infectious diseases, human rights. And then we have, for the past almost 20 years now, we established an unclassified division of the office called the Humanitarian Information Unit that focuses on complex emergencies. And the maps I'm going to show today are maps that were produced at the unclassified level, obviously, by our Humanitarian Information Unit. So I think even more alarming than the population statistics, however, is the trends in undernourishment, because not only is hunger a challenge and obviously famine becomes a crisis, but undernourishment is a tremendous challenge for productivity, as everyone here I'm sure is well aware. And even as we are doing better in terms of the prevalence, dropping the prevalence of undernourished people because of population increase, that means we're still adding more undernourished people each decade. So that is another trend I think that is alarming. I had in my office 2 years ago a Jefferson Science Fellow. It's a great program that the State Department has on attracting senior scientists to be in residence at the State Department for a year. I actually have Dr. Jason Knauf from St. Louis University, who was in my office last year. So I want to recognize him. And 2 years ago, we had Dr. Robbie Richardson from Michigan State, who's now at the Interior Department. And he contributed a chapter to a book that focused on Africa and the mega trends that you see up there. I think you can read them for yourself. I think it's no news to any of the crowd here that these are the trends that affect, I think, all of the food deficit places in the world today at a global and local scale, and those are challenges that we need to meet. So putting equity at the top of these challenges, I think the whole issue of equity will remain the greatest challenge to food security, but we also have the issues of availability and access, how to make best use of food through diet and nutrition. And then what I will focus on for the rest of my talk really is the stability issues here in terms of, in particular, a variety of different shocks. And what I don't have listed on that slide, I think, is perhaps one of the greatest challenges, and that is good governance. Again, nothing on this slide will be a surprise to anybody. These are drivers of food insecurity, and I kind of equate food insecurity with stability in my comments today. So we've got soils, we've got climate change, obviously, Pests are a tremendous problem, as are invasive species. Pests, locusts, a lot of times you have unintended consequences of good intentions, such as trying to eliminate the locusts in East Africa with pesticides that actually killed 20% of the bee population and really inhibited the pollination that takes place and diminished agricultural productivity in the region quite a bit. Natural disasters, obviously, with climate-induced intensity that we're going to see in the future. We've got disease, and we've got the economic shocks, most recently with COVID-19 that brought a lot of these issues to a head. So we have these multiple drivers that synergistically contribute to food insecurity. They're complex, they're interrelated, and they're compounding. And then, of course, in the department I work in, we're most concerned with national security related to food insecurity. And what I try to drive the conversation towards, particularly with my intelligence community colleagues, is to have the recognition that human security is actually national security. Otherwise, it's very hard to, fit a crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the heart of Africa, and why we should be concerned about hunger there. I think eventually in an interconnected and multipolar world like we have today with globalization, we have to consider that human security and national security are very intertwined and almost equivalent. And as our Secretary of State said, food security is essential to global welfare, security, and peace. So all of these issues are issues that we try to look at in my office when we're addressing issues of food instability as it relates to global insecurity and human security around the world. And so what I'm going to show for the remainder of my talk today are a series of maps that demonstrate the work that we do in my office, since that's something I know about. And I've got some eye candy for you. When Chris Tucker asked me to give this talk, or actually when he told me to give this talk, I said, well, I don't really focus on food security. He said, well, just throw up a bunch of slides from the HIU that you've done on food and talk around those issues. So that's kind of what I decided to do and contextualize it with my comments. But some of the challenges we have is our data. Everybody, when you're putting a map together, you don't want to have holes in your data. And so it's a challenge in my office. We're very concerned about the integrity of our data, and we're very concerned about the accuracy of our data and making sure that our sources are reliable. And sometimes you have to use surrogate data, sometimes you have to have holes in your data, and sometimes you have to caveat the information because when we're looking at food security, a lot of times we're using surrogates because we don't have current information always. I remember when bread riots were taking place in the what do you call it now? In the Arab Spring, not the Arab Spring. Is that right? All right. We were looking at some analyses that were looking at the bread prices, and they were retroactively looking at bread prices, saying we should have been able to predict a lot of the riots that were taking place in North Africa and the Middle East at the time, because the bread prices, once the bread prices increase, the populations get a little upset because they get hungry and they can't afford their bread. But the bread prices, you don't know the bread prices. A lot of the data aren't listed for another a couple of weeks or even a week, and that's too long of a time for people to be hungry. So it's easy to kind of retroactively recreate some early warning, but realistically, it's very hard to get that when soon enough to take preventive action. So these are important things that we think about whenever we're putting together our maps. And a lot of the maps we do support multilateral negotiations at the United Nations or the G7 or other meetings where we can provide unclassified place maps that actually sit in front of our negotiators when they're discussing many of these issues, including food security. And then obviously the biggest, that last bullet is a mouthful, but that's what we're dealing with when we're dealing with food security. Chronic instability, natural disasters, conflict and wars, climate change-induced natural disasters, lack of access to basic health care and water, sanitation, and hygiene, poor governance, and corruption. All right, that's a mouthful, and intentionally so. Okay, so now I've got some eye candy for you. Here's a look at global acute food security. And you can see on the map, it's very clear that the most food insecure areas of the world are the areas that are most conflicted. And you can see the chart on the left. I believe I can blow it up a little. You know, all those areas that are at risk of famine or acute food insecurity are areas that are in conflict, almost all those areas. And then the drivers are multifaceted, and also convergent. Economic shocks, climate, weather, natural disasters, and actual armed conflict. Focusing on Africa with the same data, again, very clear that this is a continent that bears most attention in terms of trying to make sure that by 2050, we're doing a better job of feeding the most insecure, food insecure people in the world. And this particular graphic shows undernourishment as well. This is a kind of a favorite of mine. It's a series of maps we've done over the years that we call Conflict Without Borders. And you can use this to demonstrate lots of different issues. We do diseases without borders. You can do soils without borders. You can do climate without borders. The whole point here is that when you're looking at data and when you're looking at programs of assistance, most of those are designed based on countries. A particular NGO or UN operation is designed to address a problem in a particular country, but the problems we're talking about here, including the problems that are related to Hungary, don't really respect international boundaries. And that's a challenge in terms of compiling data for maps. Another example of where you have multiple countries with similar challenges, including in this area we have Lake Chad, or what's left of Lake Chad, and in fact Boko Haram was doing a lot of illegal fishing in Lake Chad, and a lot of the population in this part of Africa relies on fish as an essential protein. Also in coastal West Africa, there's a lot of IUU fishing that is depleting the fish stocks and also taking a lot of economic value away from the countries themselves when they're fishing in their territorial waters or exclusive economic zones. Recent map we did on Sudan. We do a lot of early warning in our office as well, and the best indicator for where conflict is going to break out statistically is where conflict is already in existence, and Sudan is a good example of that. The conflict there right now. We have our diplomats meeting for figuring out how to monitor the ceasefire, how to provide humanitarian assistance, a host of other issues there. And we have a series of maps we've produced at our Humanitarian Information Unit based on some work we were doing looking at downstream impacts of COVID-19 throughout Africa, economic impacts, and we've translated that rather easily into looking at food security issues for a variety of different issues a variety of different countries throughout Africa. An area near and dear to my heart, South Sudan. I did a lot of work there, both in South Sudan and Darfur over the years, looking at refugee returns primarily and humanitarian assistance. And I love this picture because I was actually on a barge that was returning that was going down the Nile from Juba to Bor with Dinka Bor refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo who were returning to their home region. They fled as refugees with a few head of cattle, and they were coming back literally with tens of thousands of cattle onto land that agriculturalists had occupied with no land tenure system in place, and it was not hard to predict that this would lead to conflict. Horn of Africa, an area obviously of chronic instability and food insecurity. Our UN Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield just announced last week, I think $524 million worth of aid to the Horn of Africa, and relied on some of our map products in discussions with her colleagues. Another map showing, one we showed malnutrition, another one we saw we're focusing more on famine, potential for famine. So these are the topics on the right are what we try to focus on, where, how many, and then what other context. That's the critical part. That's the most important part. That's what we usually direct our products from our policymakers' priorities when they ask us to place it in a particular context of their negotiations. Then there are some forgotten places. Madagascar is one of the most food insecure and natural disaster driven countries in the world. You don't hear much about it in the press, but governance is a problem there as well. Obviously, I think everybody knows what's going on in Tigray, or what has gone on in Ethiopia, civil war there. And just across the Red Sea, Yemen is also, chronically food insecure based on conflict. Yemen was actually doing a good job of feeding itself before the civil war broke out. And I can't forget Afghanistan. It's not Africa, but I think this is probably the best example of where governance is really the critical factor now in preventing access to large portions of the population, including women. And then I have a little clip here I have to show before lunch. Up, the sound didn't come out. He's saying, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" And then they say, "More?" Anyway, that's one of my favorite shows. That's it. I don't know if there's time for questions.
It's time for a question or two.
Okay. Any questions? It's always good to be before lunch. Joe? Is that Joe?
Yes. Lee, how vital are those jurisdictional boundaries? I mean, I know they're vital from a political and management perspective, but what virtues would there be to having some of those kinds of maps become more and more granular in terms of positioning resources and other types of aid?
Well, you get granular, I think, in the digital products. That's a good question, thank you. I've been saying now for 20 years that our policymakers are going to be, much more digitally savvy and want to have interactive products. But at the end of the day, you don't get much time with them, and they're still reliant on sort of a more complicated, paper product. I would love to deliver interactive digital products to the Secretary of State while he's eating his Cheerios every morning so he can play around with it a little bit. And we're talking about doing that a little bit on some iPads. But even I think when we made a huge effort for giving making an iPad for President Obama, as you're aware of, and a lot of effort was made to digital interactive products, but he mostly used it as a book because his time was short and his briefings were fairly brief. So we do a lot of this and work with other agencies to provide that type of capacity, but that's more at the working level than at the senior level. I think that most of the senior level diplomats and negotiators are looking at a bigger picture and are not really focused in at the lower skill areas. For instance, work we've done, HIV and AIDS, trying to identify populations and access to clinics and things like that, where you have to really drill in and get that type of granular information, or access to food distribution centers, where if we're looking at refugee returns and pre-positioning supplies for things like that. But in general, for these overall products, it's the one quick snapshot that we focus on to get the biggest bang for our buck.
Thank you, Lee.
All right, thank you very much.
Besides being the geographer of the United States, Lee Schwartz is a member of the AGS Council, and there are a number of counselors that flew in here yesterday or today to be with all of you. And I'd like to ask the AGS Council members who are present to please stand.